Good morning, everybody. I'm Salavalo, and I have been to every single country in the world. But what does that mean? How many countries are there? Does the list change? How do you know how many countries there are? Are there multiple lists? Do different people have different views? Today, I am going to answer all of your questions and hopefully give you a better understanding of the interesting debate of how many countries are there in the world. Now, to do this, we have to first define what is a country. There are a couple different definitions, and people don't agree exactly on what defines a country. However, there are two things that are vitally important in order to be a country. You must have sovereignty, and you must have recognition. But what do those two words mean? There can be a lot of different definitions of what it means to have sovereignty. It can mean having your own money. It can mean having your own land. It can mean having your own military. It can mean having your own political system. But most importantly, it means having the right to do that. And what that means is that nobody else is trying to say that they have the right to do that in the land or over the population that you are, and that you have like the ultimate power in order to do so. Sovereignty is an interesting question because, for example, a lot of countries don't use their own money. They use a larger currency, something like the EU, which belongs to no specific country, but rather a group of countries. Or some countries, a lot of smaller ones, use the US dollar, which is a bit more stable, and obviously that belongs to the United States. Also, a lot of countries will be protected by larger countries, so questions of whether they actually have sovereignty or not is always up in the air. Traditionally, sovereignty has really only been granted to the superpowers of the world, and sovereignty is often, kind of the bounds of it is overstepped by the superpowers, especially in regards to smaller countries in a kind of neo-colonialism. The other thing that you need in order to be a country is recognition. Now, this typically means recognition by other countries, but more importantly, it means recognition by the international community. Right now, the only way that the international community recognizes countries is as members of the United Nations. So I'm going to go through in a second the kind of different ways that we can count countries and whether or not they're recognized by the UN or not. Of course, different countries recognize different countries. And so if you are, say, from America, you might go by the list of American recognized countries. If you're British, you might go by the British list, whatever that is. However, the international community has a list of countries that they recognize as countries, as UN member states. And that is kind of the only internationally recognized grouping that you can really go by. And that list includes all populated land in the world. In terms of international law, there is an agreement that is kind of widely recognized as defining a state. It's from the late 1930s, and it's the Montevideo Convention, which was a group of the countries in the Americas agreeing to this. This is kind of the main legal framework of a country. Is also recognized later by the European Union. And this is that there must be land, a population, a government, and the ability to have a foreign policy and to engage with other countries. Again, this ultimately boils down to having people and having land and having sovereignty over those people in that land, and having recognition that you are the one who has that sovereignty. So it's pretty simple: sovereignty, recognition. How many countries have the sovereignty and recognition, and how many have some kind of debatable status? I'm going to take you now through 7 steps from the most obviously countries to the least obviously countries, okay? And the list will just get bigger and bigger, and you'll start to understand kind of the framework or the mindset of how this works in terms of international relations and geopolitics. It also mixes in a little bit with how the travel community defines it. Of course, there are different groupings, different societies, different communities that have different definitions. What I'm going to present to you is kind of the international relations, the geopolitical angle, and not the traveler one. We'll start at the highest level, the countries that have international recognition and sovereignty, and those are the 193 members of the UN. Now, it's interesting to note that there are 6 members out of the 193 that do not have full recognition by all of the other members of the UN. However, they have a wide majority The one that has the least recognition is Israel. It's not recognized by 31 different UN members, so it only has recognition of 162. But again, that's the wide majority of the world. It has a role in the international community as much as those 31 countries or any individuals might disagree with. There's also China, which there are 14 countries that recognize Taiwan as China and not the People's Republic of China. But again, China has a seat on the Security Council. China as mainland China, has the sovereignty over the majority of the land, definitely has international recognition in terms of being recognized by, 189 countries globally. Then you have North Korea. North Korea isn't recognized by a few states, notably South Korea. And then you get also to South Korea, which isn't recognized then by North Korea. And then you have Cyprus, not recognized by Turkey. And then Armenia, which isn't recognized by Pakistan. But ultimately, these 193 countries, they meet together, they vote on things. Even if they don't recognize one another, they recognize the validity of those votes and of the presence of one another at kind of the international roundtable. There are ways that you can show that you don't recognize one another, but you can't really deny the sovereignty that the mass recognition of the others kind of allows. Now, the next level that a lot of people talk about is 195. This includes the 193 UN members and the 2 observer states. So that would be Palestine and Vatican City. Now, these 2 states, these 2 countries, they are permanently there in the UN. They observe, they're part of a few of the committees. They're recognized by other countries as part of the international community, or at least by the majority of the countries as part of the international community. However, they don't really have the sovereignty over their land. Again, they don't have all of those aspects of sovereignty that kind of allow them to be a fully recognized member of the UN, to be a fully recognized country. However, I was really happy to go to both of them. I definitely think that they are countries, but if somebody would say that they've been all countries in the world, I usually just think of the 193. The third level of countries is 201. And this includes the 6 countries that are recognized by at least one other UN member nation, so have some kind of form of international recognition. These countries are Kosovo, which is recognized by 98 different UN members, the Sahrawi Republic, or Western Sahara, which is recognized by 48 different states, mostly African ones. And then Taiwan, which is recognized by 14 states. You will realize that's the inverse of China, which is not recognized by 14, so those exact 14 are the ones that recognize Taiwan. Then you have Abkhazia, which is recognized by 6 states, and South Ossetia, which is recognized by 5 states. These include Nicaragua and Nauru and Syria, and places that kind of are, interested in that recognition. And then you have Northern Cyprus, which is recognized only by 1, which is Turkey. So that number brings you up to 201. So that's the third logical next step. However, you'll hear a lot of travelers saying 196 or 197 or I don't even know, some weird numbers. Those usually pick one of those 6. I think it's weird why you would pick one of the 6 and not all 6. I think it gets really colonial and controversial to pick one and not the other. Why would you not pick Western Sahara, but you are going to pick Northern Cyprus? Or why would you not pick Kosovo if you're not going to pick Taiwan? It completely depends on the person, but the next level kind of really makes sense is to be 201. Okay. The fourth level is countries that have a claim to some kind of sovereignty, but they do not have any international recognition. So this includes places like Somaliland, the northern part of Somalia. It includes Artsakh, previously known as Nagorno-Karabakh. It also includes Transnistria, where I have a video recently visiting. So there are handfuls of places that kind of do have some form of governance over their area, but are not recognized internationally by any countries currently, and that probably isn't changing over time. There are a handful of other different ones. But really, these ones that I'm mentioning have land and are claiming to be separate. So after this, it gets really hazy. You have 193, it's easy, 195 is easy, 201 is easy. And then after that, it gets a little bit confusing. There are a few other types of like areas that I think are interesting to talk about in this discussion, so I'll go through them now. So one interesting example is the Order of Malta. This is a historical military arm of the Catholic Church, which had land in the past and still has a lot of recognition as kind of an entity to other countries, but doesn't own any land, and doesn't have a permanent population. It's kind of like this strange area. Then we have uncontacted tribes. So in the Amazon, in some islands in India, in Papua New Guinea, potentially in some forests in the Congo, you have tribes that have been completely uncontacted. They would not know that they're part of any country, so that's kind of an interesting idea to think about. You also have rebel groups, so the one that everybody probably think about is ISIS. They had land, they had a population, but they were obviously never recognized, always at war. You also have in eastern Ukraine, you have Donetsk and Luhansk, which are kind of rebel, but they control the area, but are not recognized by anyone, although they get a lot of support from Russia. And finally, you have micronations. And so these are like little areas, usually like within the border of another country. The most famous one, a lot of you guys comment this on YouTube on different travel pages, is Sealand, which has a little territory like in an ocean. It's like a old oil rig or something. So it has land in a way. Other ones are like little towns within cities, like the one that I recently was in Vilnius. Also in Copenhagen, you have like little parts of the city that claim to be free countries. In a way, they have land, but they have no kind of sovereignty and no recognition at all. Then you go on to the sixth level of what is a country, and you have territories. Interestingly, there are a few countries in the world, all old European kingdoms, that call some of their constituent parts countries, most notably the UK, which has said it's broken up into countries, so Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. But again, there's no international recognition of those as separate entities. Obviously, there's recognition that there is Wales, but there's no like Welsh embassies anywhere, and Wales doesn't sit on international committees in terms of like geopolitics. Also, you have the Netherlands, which has some islands in the Caribbean, and then you have Denmark, which includes Greenland and Faroe Islands, and each of these three countries, each of these three kingdoms call the constituent parts countries, but again, those countries don't have the sovereignty or the recognition that really give them the status of the UN or the UN members, or even kind of like the disputed areas. You then also have places like Puerto Rico in the States. You have Hong Kong and Macau, a lot of different places that are territories of other areas, and they kind of are happy to be so, at least currently. So that kind of keeps the number that way. And then the seventh kind of category I would look at is the other travel lists. So again, everything I've said up to this point is really like looking at it in a geopolitical way. What is a country isn't so clearly defined, but this is the way that's mostly looked at. At the end of the day, anybody that has power is going to be given like a seat at the table in the international community, but it also has to be kind of agreed upon by everybody, and that's what's special about the UN and what's special about these international organizations. So the travel community has a couple like lists of other like checklists of what counts as visiting a country or a place or a region or an area. They have like different words for it. There's three famous ones beyond the UN 193, which is there's a Traveler Century Club, which has like over 300. Then there's a website called Most Traveled People that has over 800. And then there's a website called Nomad Mania, which has over 1,200. And all of these are just like lists of places to check off for travelers to go. They're not really countries. And typically the most traveled people in the world know like the difference between what is a country and what is not a country. There's also some international groupings that aren't like geopolitical, but are kind of like a special interest that have larger lists. You have the Olympic Committee, which has 206 countries that are represented in the International Olympic Committee. You have FIFA, which has 211 country teams or national teams. And then you have the ISO, which is like the websites and kind of like the calling plan and stuff. It's like the technological grouping of countries, and that has 249 countries in it as well. So I hope that this 7-step structure made some sense to you and helped you get an idea of the conversation around how many countries are there, going from UN members to UN observers to countries that are recognized by some UN members to places that have some land but aren't really countries to other interesting areas, and then to territories, and finally to like larger lists for only the sake of travel. The final interesting question is, when will there be a new country? A lot of people have been talking about this recently because in Papua New Guinea, a small island, Bougainville, they just voted for independence. They had like 97.7% of the people say that they want independence. A lot of people are messaging me and writing on social media about how there's a new country. However, the process really will take a long time. It will take a few years for them to get this sovereignty and to get this international recognition. The process for that to happen is they're now going to have an agreement with Papua New Guinea, or start to form an agreement. Hopefully it can be a peaceful one. And then if the agreement is peaceful, then the other UN member nations will likely recognize it. That's what happened between Sudan and South Sudan when South Sudan became the newest member of the UN in July 2011. I was actually supposed to be in Juba, the capital of South Sudan, on July 7th, 2011. I was in border Uganda, but they shut down the border. They wouldn't let us go through. So that kind of gutted me. So I hope that if Bougainville does become a country, that I will be there on the day that it gets its independence, officially recognized by everybody, becomes the world's newest country. There's also a couple other places like Catalonia, Scotland, have referendums, have ideas of this. Again, these processes will take years. I do not think that we'll have a new country in the next couple years, and probably very few next 10 or so, unless there's like kind of a bigger country that breaks up because of some huge crisis and it's like recognized by everybody or something like that. I have no interest in trying to go to more places just to say I've been, but I am interested in all kind of places around the world, and those places that have kind of weird sovereignty are fascinating. So I hope that this has been interesting. It's a cool conversation to have. It's always good to have the fact base when you're trying to have a conversation like this, so I hope that I've given you that. Please let me know if you have any questions at all in the comments below. I hope you subscribe, and I hope that everybody will travel safe.